No one dared to speak to the millionaire until the black maid's daughter offered Lollipop. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed across the marble floors of the Whitaker Tower, a luxury high-rise where silence usually ruled the lobby. Naomi Ellis, dressed in her crisp uniform, gently held her daughter Zuri's hand as they stepped inside, an unusual sight in a place where even the employees were expected to be invisible. Behind the reception desk, Cliff Morgan's face stiffened. He straightened his tie and stormed over, his tone sharp enough to pierce the morning calm. "You know the rules, Naomi. No kids allowed on site. This is not a daycare." Naomi opened her mouth to explain, but her voice faltered under the weight of embarrassment. Other staff members looked away, pretending not to hear. She had tried everything, called the sitter twice, asked her neighbor, but no one had answered at that hour. So she brought Zuri with her, just for the first hour of her shift. But the room changed when Zuri let go of her mother's hand. She walked, slow and steady, across the shining floor, until she stopped in front of a tall, quiet man in a charcoal suit. Graham Whitaker, the billionaire owner, the man no one spoke to unless spoken to. Zuri reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a red lollipop, and offered it to him without a word. And then, for the first time in weeks, Graham Whitaker smiled. Long before she ever stepped into the Whitaker Tower, Naomi Ellis had already learned how to survive on borrowed time and broken promises. Mornings started before the sun rose. She packed Zuri's lunch in silence, her hands moving on muscle memory while her mind calculated what bills could wait, which ones could not. After dropping off Zuri at a rundown daycare that often lost power in the afternoons, Naomi rushed to her first job at a corner diner, where tips were light and customers even lighter. By midday, she was scrubbing office floors on the east side of the city, and by evening she became nearly invisible among the polished walls of Whitaker Tower, where wealth brushed past her without making eye contact. Zuri never complained. At 6 years old, she had the kind of spirit that refused to dim. Whether she was coloring in a waiting room or watching from a quiet hallway corner, there was a light in her eyes that made people pause. Naomi often told herself that no matter how exhausting the day became, she had done something right. She had raised a kind child in a hard world. But kindness did not protect her from Cliff Morgan. He wore his authority like armor, and he sharpened it on people like Naomi. Every day he found a new reason to belittle her. Once it was a missed fingerprint on the elevator panel. Another time, it was because her shoes squeaked. But the worst was always when Zuri was involved. A month ago, Naomi had been 15 minutes late after picking up Zuri from daycare. Cliff had made a scene right there in the lobby, raised his voice, called her irresponsible, said she should be grateful she even had this job. Naomi had stood there, holding her daughter's hand, her face burning with shame. She had apologized quietly, then cleaned the same fingerprintless floor twice just to keep the peace. People whispered that Cliff had a personal grudge against her, but no one ever said it aloud. Zuri never asked why they got treated differently. She only asked if she could bring extra lollipops to share with sad people like Mr. Cliff. Graham Whitaker was a different kind of silence. He moved through the building like a shadow, never rushed, never flustered, never seen speaking to anyone unless absolutely necessary. Most employees only knew him from the portraits in the annual investor reports. Some swore they had heard him speak once. Others said he had not smiled in years. But everyone agreed on one thing. Graham Whitaker was untouchable. He owned the building. He owned several buildings. His family had held properties across the city for generations. Rumor had it, he rarely showed up to meetings unless millions were on the line. And even then, he barely said a word. Naomi had seen him only a handful of times. He walked with the kind of poise that made people straighten their backs just by proximity. She never expected to interact with him, and he never noticed her. Until now. That moment in the lobby, the red lollipop in Zuri's tiny hand, the faint curve of Graham's lips. It was as if the air itself had shifted. Cliff noticed too. After Graham walked away, Cliff's reaction had not been loud. It had been worse, quiet, calculated. He pulled Naomi aside and told her that bringing her daughter again would be considered a security risk. One more incident, and her employment would be reviewed. Naomi nodded, but her jaw clenched. She needed this job, not just for the paycheck, but for the insurance that barely covered Zuri's asthma medication, for the hope that one day they would not have to stretch canned soup for 3 nights straight. But something about Graham's reaction refused to leave her mind. He had paused, really paused, looked at Zuri like he saw someone he had not seen in years. And when he smiled, it was not polite, not superficial. It was real. That single moment planted a quiet question in Naomi's heart. Why had the most powerful man in the building, maybe in the city, paused for her daughter? And more importantly, why now? Later that same week, the lobby was unusually quiet. Naomi walked in just before sunrise, holding Zuri's small hand. She had decided to bring her daughter only for a few minutes before dropping her at a friend's house nearby. Cliff had already warned her, but she had no choice. The sitter had canceled at the last minute, and Naomi could not afford to miss another shift. Cliff was standing near the front desk. The moment he spotted them, his eyes narrowed. "You again?" he said, voice cold. "We already talked about this. No children on site." Zuri squeezed Naomi's hand, sensing the tension. Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady. "I will take her in 5 minutes, But Cliff raised a hand, cutting her off. "Rules are rules, Naomi. I have already warned you. I will need to file a report." The words hit like ice. Naomi's mouth opened, but before she could speak, a quiet voice echoed across the marble floor. "That will not be necessary." Everyone turned. Standing near the glass elevator was Graham Whitaker. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Phones were lowered, conversations stopped, even the air seemed to hold its breath. He walked forward slowly, his eyes fixed on Cliff. Not angry, just calm, coldly precise. "You told her what?" Graham asked. Cliff straightened. "Mr. Whitaker, with all due respect, she brought her child again. We have strict policy on—" "I am aware of our policies," Graham replied. Then, without taking his eyes off Cliff, he said, "But I am also aware of something you seem to have forgotten. Basic human decency." Gasps rippled through the lobby. No one could remember the last time Graham Whitaker spoke in public, let alone like this. Naomi's heart pounded. She took a step forward. "Sir, it is all right. He was just doing his job." Graham turned to her. His voice softened. "Number, it is not all right." And then he did something no one expected. He knelt down to Zuri's level. "You offered me a lollipop the other day," he said gently. "Do you have another one?" Zuri blinked, then nodded. She reached into her little bag and pulled one out. Bright blue this time. He took it with care, like it was made of glass. "Thank you," he said. "No one has given me anything without expecting something in return for a very long time." Around them, the staff stood frozen. It was not just what Graham said, it was how he said it. His voice, usually locked away behind closed boardrooms and financial briefings, now held a warmth no one had ever heard before. Something had shifted. The man who rarely spoke had just defended a janitor, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Cliff's face turned pale. He mumbled something and stepped back, clearly shaken. Naomi tried to process what had just happened. She felt exposed, confused, and oddly seen. Graham stood up and looked directly at her. "If anyone questions your presence here again," he said, "tell them you have my permission." She opened her mouth to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could speak, he was already walking away, slowly, quietly, holding that small lollipop in one hand, like it meant more than gold. From that moment on, whispers followed Naomi wherever she went. People she had worked beside for years suddenly looked at her differently. Some offered smiles, others kept their distance. No one spoke about Cliff, but they noticed he had grown quieter. What no one understood, what Naomi herself did not yet realize, was that something inside Graham had started to crack. Not because of a meeting, not because of power, because of a child's simple gift. What had locked that man away for so long? And why was Zuri the one opening the door? 2 days later, Naomi's phone buzzed during her lunch break in the janitor's closet. She almost dropped it when she saw the caller ID. Whitaker Holdings. She stared for a moment before answering. "This is Naomi." A calm, familiar voice came through. "Good afternoon. Mr. Whitaker would like to see you in his office. 15 minutes. No explanation. No time to think. She rushed to the top floor. The elevator doors opened into silence and glass. His office overlooked the entire skyline. It felt like entering a different world. Graham stood near the window, sipping tea. "Thank you for coming," he said, without turning around. Naomi stayed by the door, unsure. "Is everything all right?" He finally faced her. "Yes. Actually, I have a proposal." She waited. Her breath caught. I do not understand. Why me?" He placed a folder on the desk. "Because you show up. Every day. With grace. And your daughter reminds me of something I lost." She stepped forward, confused but moved. "Are you offering this out of pity?" His eyes met hers, calm but unreadable. "Number out of respect." She looked down at the folder. It was real. The salary alone could change everything. Rent, school, peace of mind. But inside her, doubt still lingered. Was this a hand up or a handout? Meanwhile, word had already spread downstairs. Cliff's face hardened each time Naomi passed by. His comments became sharper, his tone colder. "You think you are special now?" he hissed one morning. "Do not forget where you came from." Naomi walked away without responding, but his words stuck. One afternoon, as she waited for Zuri near the lobby's children's corner, Graham appeared unexpectedly. He sat beside her quietly, holding a small wrapped box. "I heard Zuri likes to draw," he said. Naomi blinked. "She does." He handed her the box. Inside was a new sketchbook. The cover was soft pink with Zuri's name engraved in gold. "She was drawing the other day while she waited. I saw one of her pictures." Naomi's heart warmed. "Which one?" Graham hesitated. "A man standing beside a little girl at the edge of a lake. There was a willow tree behind them." She smiled. "That is her favorite." But Graham looked distant, almost frozen. "That picture," he said softly, "looks exactly like one my daughter once drew." A long silence followed. Naomi sat still, afraid to breathe. "She passed away 3 years ago," he continued. "Her name was Lily. She loved willow trees." Naomi placed the box gently on the bench between them. "I am so sorry," she whispered. Graham nodded once, then stood. "You do not need to say anything." But she did. "I do not know what you see in us, but thank you for seeing us at all." He paused in the middle of the lobby, surrounded by marble and silence. Then he said something that Naomi would carry for years. "People think grief makes you weaker, but it does the opposite. It shows you what truly matters." That night, Naomi stayed up late reading the hotel offer again. It was not just a better job. It was a beginning. Zuri sat beside her, humming to herself and coloring. She lifted her drawing proudly. It was Graham, smiling, holding a lollipop, standing next to Zuri and Naomi. For the first time in a long while, Naomi felt something rise inside her, hope. But downstairs, Cliff was watching everything, and he was not ready to let go of his control. Not yet. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Vexford Hotel glimmered above the bustling event hall, casting a warm golden light over polished floors and velvet drapes. Guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns drifted between tables, glasses of champagne in hand. The hum of polite conversation filled the air. But Naomi's presence was a quiet kind of command. She moved through the crowd in her new role as head of housekeeping, clipboard in hand, her uniform pressed to perfection. But her uniform was not just fabric now, it was authority. Every member of the cleaning team looked to her with trust. She checked the arrangements, nodded approvingly at the staff, and directed with calm precision. In the far corner, Cliff leaned against the bar, his smirk sharp enough to cut glass. He had been watching her all evening, and Naomi could feel it. The kind of stare that wasn't admiration, but an attempt to undermine. He still could not accept the shift in power. When the speeches began, Cliff saw his chance. A hush fell over the room as the microphone was passed to him. "Before we all get too comfortable," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think it's important to remember that not everyone here started with, well, class." His eyes flicked toward Naomi. "Some people were scrubbing toilets not long ago, and enough." The voice came from the front of the room, deep, steady, and impossible to ignore. Graham Davenport, owner of the hotel, mentor to Naomi, and a man whose presence could silence a crowd, stood from his table. The conversation died instantly. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Cliff. "You speak of work as if it were shameful. Let me tell you something about shame." The guests shifted uneasily, sensing the moment was no longer just about Naomi. "I once had a daughter," Graham began, his voice quieter now, but carrying to every corner of the room. "She was 7, laughed like summer wind. One day, one ordinary day, she was gone. A car accident. And just like that, the world went silent." The room stilled. Naomi froze where she stood, her clipboard pressed to her side. "For months, I walked through this hotel like a ghost. I could not smile. I could not look anyone in the eye. I didn't want to live. Then, one afternoon, I was sitting in the lobby when a little girl, no older than my own had been, came up to me. She had nothing to give me but a lollipop. She didn't even speak. She just offered it. And for the first time in months, I smiled." Graham's eyes glistened, but his voice remained firm. "That little girl's kindness saved me more than she will ever know. And when I see Naomi, I see that same spirit. The kind that lifts people up when they are broken. That is worth more than every chandelier in this room." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Naomi felt her throat tighten, her vision blur. She had not known this story. She had not known that in helping her, Graham was finding his own way back. Graham's gaze hardened as he turned to Cliff. You drag people down. This hotel has no place for that." He glanced toward security. "Escort him out, and tell payroll he is finished. Effective immediately." Cliff's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but the guards were already moving. The guests watched in stunned silence as he was led toward the exit, his arrogance stripped bare. Naomi stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had imagined this moment, Cliff being held accountable, but she had never imagined it would come wrapped in such raw truth. As the crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing conviction, Naomi realized something. Graham had not just stood up for her. In some way, she had stood up for him too. The applause swelled, but Naomi's mind was somewhere else entirely. Because in Graham's story, there had been a detail that didn't feel accidental. The way he had looked at her when he mentioned the little girl with the lollipop. Could it be? The thought lingered like an unspoken question. And as the night continued, Naomi could not shake it. What happened next between her, Graham, and the shadow of a daughter he had lost? The sun was warm that afternoon as Naomi and Zuri walked toward the park. The air smelled faintly of fresh grass and blooming flowers, and Zuri's little hand swung happily in hers. Graham was already there, sitting on a wooden bench under the shade of an old oak tree. He looked up when he saw them, his face softer than Naomi had ever seen it. Zuri ran ahead and climbed onto the bench beside him. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a brightly wrapped lollipop. "This one's for your smile," she said with a small grin. For a moment, Graham just stared at her, almost startled. Then, slowly, his lips curved upward, not the polite, guarded smile Naomi had seen before, but a real, unfiltered laugh that shook his shoulders. The sound was light, almost like a memory returning. Naomi watched him, feeling a lump form in her throat. They stayed in the park for hours. Zuri chased butterflies, Graham told her silly riddles, and Naomi, she let herself breathe. There was no tension, no fear of being judged or dismissed. For the first time in a long while, it felt like they belonged, right there, in that small circle of peace. A week later, Naomi was called into a meeting at work. This time it was different. No condescending tones, no quiet doubts. The leadership team offered her a long-term role, not out of pity, but because they had seen her skill, her strength, and her results. "We trust you with this," her manager said simply. Naomi left the building with her head high. She knew what this meant. She and Zuri had a future that was steady, safe, and entirely their own. That evening, she found Graham in the same park. He was tossing a small ball to Zuri, who giggled every time she caught it. Naomi sat beside him. "You seem lighter," she said. "I guess I forgot how to live without the weight," he replied quietly. "But you two reminded me." The three of them sat there as the sky turned gold. Naomi realized that she was no longer holding her breath in life, no longer bracing for the next hurt. She was seen, she was heard, and she was safe. And Graham, he wasn't alone anymore. The cafe doors swung open to a familiar sound, Zuri's little sneakers pattering against the wooden floor. She dashed inside, a beaming smile on her face. "Uncle Graham," she called, her voice echoing through the space. Graham looked up from the counter, his stern, businesslike face softening instantly. He crouched down to meet her, opening his arms. Zuri flew into his embrace, giggling as he lifted her high into the air. Naomi stood in the doorway for a moment, watching them. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Life had changed in ways she could never have imagined. She still worked at the cafe, but now her shifts were balanced with evening classes. Just last month, she had received an envelope in the mail, an acceptance letter and a full scholarship to study hospitality management at one of the best institutes in the city. The letter said only one thing about the funding: anonymous donor. Naomi had her suspicions. Zuri skipped over, holding a juice box, chattering about her day at school. "We made art today, Mama. I made something for you." Later that evening, Naomi sat at their small kitchen table. Zuri's backpack sat beside her chair, half unzipped. She reached inside, pulling out a sheet of paper folded in half. When she opened it, her breath caught. It was a crayon drawing. 3 stick figures stood under a giant red heart. One had short brown hair and a bow tie. Clearly Graham. One wore a dress. Naomi. Between them stood a small girl with curly hair and a wide smile, Zuri. Above their heads, in bright, uneven letters, were just 2 words: family forever. Naomi felt her eyes sting. She pressed the paper to her chest, a soft smile spreading across her face. For the first time in a long time, she knew they were not alone. Some families were born, others were chosen, and this one was both.